to Catholicism, there is so much to learn. This podcast exists to help that. In the 27 episodes of 2025, I focus on some of the major teachings of the Church. That will continue, but I want to expand the variety of offerings a bit in 2026. One way in which that will be done will be by having occasional episodes on some of the great books of the faith. There are a number of them, and each one has much in it to enrich our lives and enrich our faith. Today, we look at the first autobiography ever written, St. Augustine's book, Confessions, which was written 1,600 years ago and will really blow you away, even today. Welcome to episode 28 of All Roads Lead to Rome, the podcast for Protestants and the non-religious that helps you understand Catholicism and helps you make the journey there in a way that is easier and more organized than I did. I'm Dr. Bickford, and I want to thank you for your support and prayers as we enter the new year of exploring Catholicism. I hope your New Year's resolution is to hit the follow or subscribe button to your podcast player or YouTube. Also, please tell a friend about us. St. Augustine was born on November 13th in the year 354 in Thagaste in North Africa, which is today in Algeria. He lived in the final days of the Roman Empire. His father, Patricius, was a pagan, and his mother, Monica, was a devout Christian. He was a prodigy from day one, and so his parents invested heavily in his education. He trained for a career in rhetoric, which is public speaking. He eventually ended up in the city of Milan in northern Italy. At that point in the history of the Roman Empire, Rome was still considered the capital, but it was much too crowded and too hot in the summer, so the imperial court and the administrative structure of the empire had moved to Milan. After all, if you had the chance to move to Milan, wouldn't you? Beautiful place. If Augustine wanted to be a speechwriter and a public speaker for the powerful and famous, Milan in those years was the place to be. He had a big ego, and he desperately wanted to shine on the biggest stage. After a youth filled with debauchery and excess, he joined a religion called the Manicheans. Now, you've heard me talk before about a heretical Christian sect called the Gnostics. They took too much of bad philosophy from the Greeks and have always been lurking in the corners of Christianity. Well, the Manicheans had a very similar view on many areas to the Gnostics. Augustine was attracted to them because they promised to offer rational explanations for the existence of both good and evil. Their argument was that there was a good God and an evil God, and they were in battle with each other at all times. You know, kind of like the light side and the dark side of the Force in Star Wars. They're always in tension, always trying to take over the other side. He was devoted to this religion for almost 10 years, but grew disillusioned because they couldn't adequately explain the existence of evil and suffering, at least not enough for his sharp mind. Through all of this, his mother, Monica, prayed and prayed for him. When Augustine was in Milan, he encountered the bishop of the city, St. Ambrose. Ambrose is another one of the truly great Christians to ever live, and he, like Augustine, is one of the 28 doctors of the church. There must have been something in the water in those years. Ambrose deserves his own episode, but for now, trust me that his brilliant mind did a lot to influence the brilliant mind of a young Augustine. Well, finally, in the year 386, Augustine had a dramatic conversion experience. Listening to children sing as they played, he was sure he heard them say, "Tolo lege," which is Latin for, take and read, take and read. He had a Bible with him, and so he randomly opened it to Romans chapter 13, verses 13 and 14, which says, quote, "Let us live honorably as in the day, not in reveling and drunkenness, not in debauchery and licentiousness, not in quarreling and jealousy. Instead, put on the Lord Jesus Christ and make no provision for the flesh to gratify its desires." End quote. That moment changed his life. In the year 387, he was baptized by Ambrose. And if you visit Milan today, you can see the actual baptismal font that was used. His mother died shortly later, but she had her lifelong dream of him becoming Christian fulfilled. He then moved back to North Africa and started a monastic community devoted to prayer and study, and he wished to spend the rest of his life there. However, in 391, he was ordained a priest, kind of against his own will, in the town of Hippo, which is the modern city of Annaba in Algeria. And in 396, he was made a bishop of Hippo, also pretty much against his will. But he did perform his duties well. He wrote tirelessly. He saw the sack of Rome in the year 410 and died on August 28th in the year 430 as the barbaric Vandals were besieging the city of Hippo. His body was eventually moved to Pavia in Italy, and he still rests there today. He left behind hundreds of letters, of sermons, a number of books, and 3 monumental works. One was called The City of God, which was written after Rome fell. In it, he argued that we cannot put our hope in political entities like kingdoms or empires. He called that the city of man. And the city of man also represents the love of self. He argued instead that our true fealty was to the city of God. We were created to have God as our true love, and that's where our attention needs to be. The second great work was De Trinitate, which is a complex book on the nature of the Trinity, where God is seen as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And a lot of the understanding we have today really starts to emerge in that book. His third great work is his autobiography, The Confessions. This book was published around the year 400, and this book is the focus of today's episode. So, if you want to read the book, it's a great read, but you need to read it slowly. It isn't like a modern novel with lots of filler, where the writer can go on and on and on for hundreds of pages describing a scene. Confessions was written more than 1,000 years before the invention of the printing press. So at that point, making copies of books was done by hand and done very slowly, and it was very expensive. A small book in today's dollars would have cost thousands of dollars. And so writers back then had a discipline where they used an economy of words so that their books said everything that needed to be said but did not waste space. Now, Confessions is about 300 pages, and it's broken into what Augustine calls 13 books. Each book is what we would call a chapter. It also has chapters, though, and each chapter is every couple of paragraphs. Each time there's a change in the thought or argument. You also need to know about this book that it's written as a prayer to God. The whole book is Augustine reflecting on his life with God, on sin, on grace, on God's providence, and in it he is painfully honest. And through the whole book, he's addressing God. You and I, as the readers, are just sort of eavesdropping on what he's saying. He not only goes through the bad things he did, but he reflects on the reasons why and what the effects of them were. And so what happens is reading it can help you find the words you may need to describe some of the experiences in your life that you've never been able to fully explain before. He also goes through his conversion in detail. And all through the story, he weaves passages of Scripture as if they're just part of the sentences of the conversation. Confessions is a brilliant work. And for these reasons and many more, it has been read, studied, and quoted by the faithful for the last 1,600 years. When I was in high school, there were 2 quotes that we recited over and over, and they became part of my daily vocabulary and thinking. One was a line from Socrates that said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." The other is from the first page of Augustine's Confessions, where he says, "Thou," referring to God, "thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." I've spent many hours throughout my life reflecting on these 2 quotes. So, if there's only one quote that you remember from this episode, let it be that one, right from page 1. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. It speaks to why we were created, and it tells us the only path to happiness. Everything else in the world and life will leave us with restless hearts. We were made to love God. We were made to be in a holy relationship with God. Nothing else will do. Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. So let's walk through the book now. In book 1, really chapter 1 of the Confessions, Augustine talks about his early life. He recognized, looking back on it, that even as a child, he was selfish, he was proud, and he was only focused on things that he wanted. Book 2 talks about his adolescence. He wrote, quote, I had grown deaf from the clanking of the chain of my morality, the punishment for the pride of my soul. And I departed from you, referring to God, and you left me to myself. And I was tossed about and wasted and poured out and boiling over in my fornications. And you were silent. Oh, my late one joy. You were silent. And I, arrogant and depressed, weary and restless, wandered further and further from you into more and more sins which could bear no fruit but sorrows. End quote. I told you this in Economy of Words. What does this all mean? When we are determined to go our own way, no matter how painful, there are times that God will let us go. Sometimes we refuse to learn from God and need to learn painful lessons from experience instead. And one of the lessons of the faith we often choose to ignore is that when we insist on going our own way, God will let us. Next in book 2 comes a very famous incident that's worth remembering. Augustine tells the story of a pear tree on someone else's property. He and his friends stumbled across it, jumped over the wall, and filled their pockets with pears that they were stealing. They weren't hungry. The pears didn't even appear desirable. And actually, he says they threw most of them at nearby pigs. So why did he do it? In his own words, quote, our only pleasure was in doing what was forbidden. They only did it because they knew they shouldn't. They got nothing from it other than the satisfaction that they were being bad, and that thrilled them. At a deeper level, the telling of the story is a reflection on the notion of something called disordered love. And it's a struggle all humans have to contend with. Disordered love is when we choose pride and rebellion over God. It's when we love created things more than the Creator. We experience love, but it's distorted because it's being expressed in an area that it wasn't created for. So, even if you haven't had an experience like this in stealing just for the sake of stealing, there are still ways that you have manifested disordered love in your life and on your road to conversion. It's a basic human struggle. In book 3, while continuing his studies, he doesn't get married, but he takes on a concubine, which basically means he's living with his girlfriend. And he and his girlfriend have a son named Adeodatus. So he's leading a pretty hedonistic life. But at the same time, it's when he becomes a Manichean. And again, they embraced this sort of dualism where there are good and evil gods doing battle with each other over every soul. It's here that he first discovers philosophy. And this is what leads to his early questions about the Manicheans. In book 4, Augustine is now teaching in Carthage, but a very close friend of his dies. And this shatters him and sends him into deep despair. He struggled with the failure of the Manicheans to answer his questions about mortality. And he also struggled with his own ambition for fame. His whole life had grown restless, and he couldn't find the answer. Do you remember what he said on page 1? Something he hasn't learned yet, but he will in the future, and looking back, he reflects on it. When he said to God, "Our hearts are restless until they rest in thee." He doesn't know this point. He doesn't know it at this point in book 4, but he's getting closer. In book 5, a lot happens. Augustine is now 28, and he is seeing more and more the incongruities with the Manichean beliefs. Other members tell him that their bishop, Faustus, is coming for a visit, and that he can answer all of Augustine's questions that they were unable to. Here is his description of the encounter with Faustus. Quote, "I had looked forward with an unbounded desire to the coming of this Faustus. For the others whom I had met, when they failed to find answers to the questions of the sort I posed, they promised me Faustus. On his arrival, and by conference with him on these things, would be most lucidly explained, together with any more important questions that I might ask. When at last he came, I found him a pleasant man, of pleasant speech, who rolled off the tongue the same kind of things that the others had said, but with a great deal more charm." End quote. Augustine's just being polite. Faustus had no answers to his questions. Augustine had waited more than 9 years in the religion and had little to show for it. And he decides he needs to leave. He decides to go to Rome to further his education and to work on his career of becoming a famous speechwriter. His mother wanted him to stay in Carthage in North Africa, so he ended up having to lie to her, and he left without her knowing. Then he got to Rome and got very sick. He thought he was dying. But after his recovery, he realized he was surrounded by philosophers who were all skeptics. They argued that truth cannot be known, and he reacted as I would have. He left. Just like many people today, we, in our late 20th, early 21st centuries, we are surrounded by people who are deeply skeptical about truth, about God, about faith. And more people are leaving that because it's unsatisfying. So Augustine did the same. He left Rome and he went to Milan. And as I said earlier, the emperor and the imperial court had moved to Milan. So Augustine goes up there. He was able to secure a teaching position. And it's there that he heard that the local bishop, the great St. Ambrose, was an incredible speaker. So Augustine went to the masses at the cathedral just to listen to him. At first, Augustine focused on Ambrose's style, on his delivery as a gifted speaker. But over time, Augustine then fell in love with the message of Christ that he was speaking, and also with Ambrose's allegorical approach to the interpretations of Scripture. Much to Augustine's surprise, Ambrose was answering questions about evil and suffering that the Manicheans never could. And again, what was driving Augustine is this restlessness of heart. He wanted to find the truth and was willing to follow wherever this journey led. But at the same time, he was struggling with his own ego and ambition, and the two were in very deep conflict. And you know what? A big part of the appeal for the Confessions over the many centuries is that that we can relate to this restlessness that Augustine has, and it can give us words to describe and understand our own experiences. Then we come to book 6. His mother, Monica, found out where he had gone, and she followed him all the way to Milan. She was happy that he turned his back on the Manicheans, but was unhappy that he still wasn't a Christian. She joined him in going to the cathedral and to hear Ambrose. And Augustine wrote this to describe his state at the time. And remember, he's not speaking to you and me, he's speaking to God. And this is what he says, quote, "I was all hot for honors, money, marriage, and you made mock of my hotness. In my pursuit of these, I suffered most bitter disappointments. But in this, you were good to me, since I was thus prevented from taking delight in anything not yourself. Look now into my heart, Lord, by whose will I remember all this, and confess it to you. Let my soul cleave to you now that you have freed it from the tenacious hold of death. At that time, my soul was in misery, and you pricked the soreness of its wound, that leaving all things, it might turn to you, who are over all, and without whom all would return to nothing, that it might turn to you and be healed. End quote. That's a lot. God is actually picking at his sores to make them worse, so that Augustine will turn to him and finally be healed. If you can relate, you will find so much from Augustine, especially this book. And if you can relate, of course, then my question to you now is to ask, well, which of the sores you have is God picking at? And if you know what sore it is, you are very close to being healed indeed. And so what was the problem in Augustine's life right now? Well, he describes it this way. A moment comes and he has his discovery, and this is what he writes. Quote, I was preparing an oration, a speech. I was preparing an oration in praise of the emperor, in which I was to utter any number of lies, to win the applause of people who knew that they were lies, end quote. This was haunting him. He was going to tell lies, and people were going to know they were lies, but he was doing it to win their approval. This was craziness to him. And then he writes this. He went out and goes for a walk, and then he writes this, quote, I was passing along a certain street in Milan when I noticed a beggar. He was jesting and laughing, and I imagine more than a little drunk, end quote. And so Augustine watches this, and he compares the struggles and difficulties he was enduring in his quest for fame and happiness to what the drunken beggar was doing, who didn't have a care in the world, didn't have a dime to his name, and yet was perfectly happy. I know and have worked with so many people who would be perfectly happy to lie, cheat, and defame others for the chance to get ahead. People who would gladly stab others in the back and not lose a moment of sleep over it. And yet those very people, when they reach the peak of what they're trying to achieve, they find they're less happy than they were before. Well, Augustine was not going to be that kind of person. His conscience tore at him. And we have front row seats to watch as this is happening. The story of the drunken beggar is a very important one in Augustine's life. And it's one of the stories I hope you remember from this episode. What is the point of struggling up the corporate ladder when even reaching the top will not bring meaning or happiness? But then it gets worse for him. His mother, Monica, had arranged for him to marry a young woman from a powerful and wealthy family. This meant that he had to give up his live-in girlfriend. And in Book 6, he does so, something that tormented him the rest of his life. So much so that he never gives us her name. But there's a problem. The woman he was to marry was still too young to get married. He was going to have to wait for a few years. And he didn't really want to wait for her. So he decided that while he was waiting for her, he would go find another girlfriend to pass the time. And his conscience was tearing at him for this as well. In words he would use years later, our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. In Book 7, Augustine is now 30 and wrestling with the questions of theology. In this book, Book 7, he gets past seeing God as being human-like. He's wrestling with Plato and Platonic thinking, and he's listening to Ambrose and his sermons, and he comes to change his understanding of the nature of evil. Now, this part's a bit complex, but try to stay with me on it. He realizes that the world is not made up of a good God and a bad God that are locked in battle, like Star Wars and like the Manicheans believed. He came to see evil instead as a privation of the good. That's a term we still use today, privation of the good. Well, what does that mean? If you want a detailed explanation, go back to episode 17 of this podcast, which was on evil. The easiest comparison is to look at cold and hot. Do you know there's no such thing as cold? Only various levels of heat. So you start at the bottom with a temperature called absolute zero, which is 460 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit and 273 degrees below 0 Celsius. There is no temperature below that because there is no heat held in atoms. And then what happens is you start injecting heat into the atoms and the temperature starts to increase. So temperature, what we call cold and hot, is just a measure of how much energy is in the atom. And it goes from nothing to really a high number. And that's temperature. The analogy is that good and evil are similar. That there's no such thing as evil, just levels of good. And so absolute zero is the devil. There is no good at all in the devil, pure evil. Absolute goodness at the other extreme is God. We say God is goodness itself. Everything else is a measure somewhere between the two limits. So evil is not a competitor to good, it's an absence of good. The more holy something is, the more good it has. And the more evil something is, the less good it has. Now, that may sound strange, but it's an important concept. And the reason for this is it answers the question of why would a good God create evil in the world? The Manicheans couldn't answer it. They knew there was an evil God, but they couldn't answer why a good God would create that. Well, the answer is God does not create evil, but allows it. Because allowing for the possibility of it is the only way that we can have free will. We're called to have maximum good, but if we have free will, we can reject that and have less good, and go all the way down depending on our use of our free will. Again, this may sound strange, but the more you think about it, the deeper this issue gets. And as much as we want to blame God for evil things, what this understanding ends up showing you is that most of the evil we encounter, with the exception of natural disasters, is caused by us, exercising free will in a terrible and sinful way. And in Book 7, Augustine finally sees how all of this works. There are other important discoveries from here, but we don't have time to go through them in this episode. Suffice to say, he has a major awakening in his understanding of philosophy and of Christian theology. And he ends Book 7 describing his discovery of the writings of Paul in the New Testament. In Book 8, Augustine finally makes the commitment and converts to Christianity. It starts with his final struggles and with a painfully honest moment. He had lived a life of lust and indulgence. He knew that the path to Christianity included a life of continence, which in his case was going to be a life of celibacy. No marriage, no sex. So early in Book 8, he gives a very famous line, which a lot of people laugh at today, but it shows something really profound. It's a level of honesty that few of us ever dare. He writes this, quote, "In my great worthlessness, for it was greater thus early, I had begged you for chastity, saying, 'Grant me chastity and continence, but not yet.' For I was afraid you would hear my prayer too soon, and too soon would heal me from the disease of lust, which I wanted satisfied rather than extinguished." End quote. Have you ever heard anything more honest? He knew what he needed to do, but he was afraid to pray for it because God might grant his prayer. But then finally we get to the moment of conversion. He's sitting in a park at a loss over what to do with his life, and he hears children singing, Tolo lege, take and read. And he opened his Bible to Romans 13, which urged him to abandon his lust and take on Jesus Christ instead. At that moment, his heart was filled with peace. And he then went on to his mother to tell her that all of her years of prayer for him had finally paid off. Augustine was a Christian. Book 9 tells us that at the Easter Vigil on April 24th in the year 387, Bishop Ambrose baptized Augustine and Augustine's son, Adeodatus, at the cathedral. Augustine then quit his job teaching rhetoric. He didn't want to be involved in the lies anymore. And he agreed with his mother to return home to North Africa. And so they made their way to Rome and then down the Tiber River to Ostia, where the Tiber meets the ocean. And while waiting for a ship to take them to North Africa, she grew ill. And there she died. It's too long to read here, but it's beautifully written. It puts a lump in your throat when you read this whole section of the book. I'll leave it for you to find it and read it. She died when she was 56 and he was 33. Less than a year later, Adeodatus died as well. Augustine's new understanding of suffering and mortality was really being put to the test. But he had converted to Christianity with a full sense of commitment, and his commitment saw him through both deaths. And then, in Book 10, Augustine shifts his focus from explaining the events of his life to reflecting on how human memory works and how it's a metaphor for the depth of the soul. He also admits to his continuing struggles with pride and sensuality, and about how conversion is not a momentary thing, but a lifelong journey into the grace of God. And as he looks back on how long it took for him to finally reach this point, he gives a very well-known line where he says, quote, and again talking to God, quote, "Late have I loved thee, O beauty so ancient and so new. Late have I loved thee. For behold, thou wert within me, and I outside. And I sought thee outside, and in my unloveliness fell upon those lovely things that thou hast made. Thou wert with me, and I was not with thee. I was kept from thee by those things, yet had they not been in thee, they would not have been at all. Thou didst call and cry to me and break open my deafness. And thou didst send forth thy beams and shine upon me and chase away my blindness. Thou didst breathe fragrance upon me, and I drew in my breath and do now pant for thee, and not hunger and thirst for thee. Thou didst touch me, and I have burned for thy peace." End quote. We all need to have a faith that burns so bright. There are 3 more books, but they're more of a study of the book of Genesis and about more of his life. He wrestles with the mystery of time, creation, sin, disorder, desire, and he shows how the allegorical interpretation of Ambrose works and remains faithful to what the scripture writers wrote. Very good stuff, but this episode is going to run much too long if I go into it. Confessions has stood the test of time for 1,600 years. Augustine is quoted more than any other church father in the Liturgy of the Hours, mostly in the office of readings. If you pray it, you will read from Confessions, excerpts from lots of sermons, and so on. His feast day is August 28th, to remember his death, and his mother Monica's feast day is the day before, August 27th, which is also my daughter's birthday. Thomas Aquinas in the Summa Theologiae quotes Augustine more than anybody else. People think he quotes Aristotle the most. He actually quotes Augustine more. You can't go wrong with Augustine. There's actually a monastic order of monks called the Augustinians. Been around for a very long time. In fact, one really prickly monk they had was a guy named Martin Luther, who started the Protestant Reformation and has been the source of all sorts of mischief for the last 500 years. Pope Leo XIV, the current pope, is an Augustinian as well. The order runs a lot of high schools, a number of universities, and a lot of mission centers. In the United States, they run 2 colleges, Villanova in Pennsylvania and Merrimack College in Massachusetts, where I have taught. They're a fascinating order, but again, that would take more time than we have available to go into it. All right, so what will be on the test? Just the most famous quotes of Augustine from this book. From page 1, O Lord, thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in thee. From book 2, the story of the soul in pairs. It matters because it's a reflection on how and why we do the bad things when we know they are bad. From book 6, the story of the drunken beggar, wrestling with what really brings happiness and learning how to listen to our conscience when it's calling us out on the bad things we do. From book 8, one of the most honest lines ever written by anyone, God grant me chastity and continence, but not yet. And then finally in book 10, late have I loved thee, O beauty, so ancient and so new. Late have I loved thee. Augustine knew that there was a real and objective truth. And when his life didn't conform to it, he didn't change the definition of truth. He knew he had to change his life. You and I are living in a world where we don't believe in objective truth. And so if we want to be religious, we have to shape the religion around what we want to believe and do with our lives. If you are on the journey to Catholicism, you need to start thinking the way Augustine did. There is real and objective truth that your life needs to conform to. It's a very difficult struggle. But when Augustine made it, he found true happiness. You are called to do the same, and you will find true happiness as well. It's not an easy road, but it's better than all of the other roads. So whatever road you happen to be on, take the right turn and come to Rome. Because the only way to happiness is to be on the road that leads to Rome.